All right, welcome everybody to Grail Country. I'm super honored to have Jordan Daniel Wood as a conversation partner today. I'll do a brief introduction of Jordan's many accolades. Jordan has a master's and PhD in historical theology and is the author of a book called The Whole Mystery of Christ, Creation as Incarnation in
And
Maximus
is
the
the
Temple.
author of a book called.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
I got an echo.
Yeah, got it. I thought that would happen. Sorry, go
Um,
ahead.
yeah, which I think is just like perfect for what we want to talk about. So, as many of you already know, I'm a huge fan of George MacDonald, but especially of his imagination essay.
Hmm.
And as far as I know, Jordan, you weren't familiar with this one, right?
Right. I had only read The Fantastic Imagination, which is far smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of is put there at the beginning of the fairy tales, which is actually one of the first things I ever read by MacDonald. And so you introduced me to this essay, which is so good.
So good.
It's awesome. Actually, in fact, I went and found a copy of the A Dish of Orts
Yep.
just because I was like, I can't just, right here. I got the papers, but it's like I need
Yeah.
the actual book. So anyway, thank you for that.
Oh, good. Good. I'm glad. I mean, I have been pushing it on Martin Shaw and Michael Martin and, ad nauseum. And I don't think anybody's actually taken the time um, to do it. We all get recommendations from people. I totally
Sure.
understand. But I just think that this is an incredible essay. And I'm sure that you can, agree because of your book.
Yeah. No,
Creation
it
as
was
incarnation, right?
absolutely. And yeah, it's funny because I'm teaching a Bible class for freshmen here at Belmont this semester, and we're actually ending on MacDonald's essay, The Fantastic Imagination.
Okay.
Because since the first time I read that, which is a very small distillation, this is far richer, but
Yeah.
um, I always thought, this is the perfect essay. Like some of his ideas are the perfect ideas to kind of frame, the task of interpretation generally, but of scripture in particular. And so, what you've given me here, sort of, man, I'm gonna have to rethink a lot of things. So anyway,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Well, the one thing about the fantastic imagination that I've noted here, but something I realized for myself was he's dealing largely with the concept of meaning in the
yeah,
fantastic imagination. And he believes that meaning will unfold for us over time and that whatever meaning we get is the meaning we're capable of understanding and acting upon, because of course for him it's all about acting upon things,
hmm
right?
hmm
Obedience is like the main theme throughout George MacDonald's works. So, but before we dig into that, I have a little question. What was your first encounter with George MacDonald?
Oh, so honestly, the first encounter I ever had was reading the fairy tales. Just the Penguin edition of the complete fairy tales. So, taken
Okay.
out of like At the Back of the North Wind, like taken from some of those um, novels or novellas. And so that was the first. So that really was my entry, like the Golden Key and,
Hmm.
and like um, all those stories there. And I loved that as a way into George MacDonald. Like I had actually tried to read The Hope of the Gospel, his little
Yeah.
prose book, and I liked it. I mean, but for some reason, it was really were the stories, the fairy tales that kind of made the prose pop. Which, of course, in light of this essay, it kind of makes sense. The whole thing about poetry as the origin and source of all language, and
Yeah.
poetry is not elevated prose, but sort of in fact, prose are sort of half interred poetry that you have to dig up. And
Yeah.
but so yeah, that was my way in. And then the next thing I did, because I was like, well, I love these fairy tales and stuff, and they're really great, but I kind of want to get some bigger. So I got that. I think it was like an old Erdman's volume, that did Fantasies with Lilith.
Okay.
in one volume, and so I got that. In fact, that volume is now destroyed, both from me reading it and from my kids, and so I had to buy new versions. But so it really was in his fiction. His fiction was my way in,
Yeah.
and only after had I read those things did I then go read the unspoken sermons, and that was just
Yeah.
a real
Just
glory.
opened up all the fiction.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm ashamed to say that my way in was through the unspoken sermons, because I actually tried once when I was like 28, I think, to read At the Back of the North Wind to my daughter. Someone had given it to me and said, "Oh, this man's a Christian. You should read it." Like he got the big approval. And I started reading it and I thought, my God, this person is out of their mind. What is wrong with this man? And I actually thought, maybe he was on drugs when he wrote this. Like,
I could see that, having read that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I gave up on it. I never went any further than that. And then Luke Thompson recommended that I read the Justice Sermon once, about 5-6 years ago. And I read that, and I had to literally stop several times during that and cry, like just like big weeping kind of crying. And then, of course, I started to devour the unspoken sermons. And then I read, I think it was Lilith first. And then I read Fantastes, which I don't really recommend, because Fantastes is like Lilith is like a reworking of Fantastes to me in a way.
Right.
Yeah. And then the short stories and poetry and,
Yeah.
And I haven't been able to get away from the man ever since.
Yeah, that's how I am too. And that's why I was really delighted when you actually had something that we could read that I hadn't read from him, because it's never, to me, if you recommend something from George MacDonald and I haven't read it, that is the easiest yes. It's just like, okay, let's go. I'm excited, because we all have our things and we're taken away and we have other things to read or whatever, or I'm like trying to prepare for classes. But even in my classes, I found I work MacDonald in, like, I teach a course called Christian Doctrine. I think they read 3 different sermons from George MacDonald.
Wow.
And I even give them an option to listen to this, especially the Justice Sermon. They read that, and but I give them a link as well to what I think is a pretty good reading out loud of it. So
Yeah.
and then that's another thing I wanted to mention was, around the time I really started getting into MacDonald, I was going into my doctoral program. And so this I just say this because it kind of helps situate my approach to MacDonald. I sort of inclined towards, I think probably not always helpful, but like academic, almost like prose stuff, a little bit dry here and there. And I think the only time I had ever really heard George MacDonald mentioned was like in the category of something called devotional literature.
Right.
And I think that's fine, but that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And what I really was impressed by, especially by that Justice Sermon, when I read that, was like, okay, yes, like this he has the gift of speaking to my entire being all the time.
Yeah.
But that actually does include, like, I think he's a genius.
Yes.
Like on every level, and so I ended up doing like my comprehensive exams, one for a few of the questions, you can basically create your own question and your own bibliography.
Yeah.
So I actually, in order to find an excuse to read them more, I did one of my whole questions on his universalism, or his eschatology, and comparing it to the Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Ruthven Balthasar.
Oh, okay, cool.
So I wrote like a whole sort of essay on their two, like their approaches and where they were similar, where they were pretty different. And so I kind of had this thing with MacDonald. What I love about him, I guess, is the point of this, is that I kind of feel like almost anyone could come to him and you will get something.
Yes, exactly. Children, like,
exactly.
And people like me, farmers, farmers, and and theologians like you, there's a gulf between us, Jordan.
Well, the gulf
At least for me.
is manifold, because there's probably many things you do I wouldn't have the first clue about. So.
Okay. I was going to say something about something you said back there, but now I forget what it was. I'm just really excited to get to talk to you about this, because I'm not a theologian, but in a way I am. I draw my theology out of my own experiences. And I think that's what largely speaks to me through George MacDonald's writings, because he's giving his theology living substance. They're characters in his novels and their places, and that's the kind of thing that I can relate to. I'm more able to decipher what he's talking about in that setting than if I was to read a lot of theological language. So So I have a bunch of quotes here. I was going to read, just for everybody else's sake, the first, the opening paragraphs of the essay, because I think they kind of state his case.
Yeah.
And I'll try to read it as quickly as possible. There are those in whose notion education would seem to consist in the production of a certain repose through the development of this and that faculty, and the depression, if not eradication, of this and that other faculty. But if mere repose were the end in view, an unsparing depression of all the faculties would be the surest means of approaching it, provided always the animal instincts could be depressed likewise, or better still, kept in a state of constant repletion. Happily, however, for the human race, it possesses in the passion of hunger even a more immediate savior than in the wisest selection and treatment of its questioning. Did I get that right? No. In the wisest selection and treatment of its faculties. For repose is not the end of education. Its end is a noble unrest, an ever-renewed awakening from the dead, a ceaseless questioning of the past for the interpretation of the future, an urging on of the motions of life, which had better far be accelerated into fever than retarded into lethargy. By those who consider a balanced repose the end of culture, the imagination must necessarily be regarded as the one faculty before all others to be suppressed. Are there not facts, say they? Why forsake them for fancies? Is there not that which may be known? Why forsake it for inventions? What God hath made into that, let man inquire. We answer, to inquire into what God has made is the main function of the imagination. It is aroused by facts, is nourished by facts, seeks for higher and yet higher laws in those facts, but refuses to regard science as the sole interpreter of nature, or the laws of science as the only region of discovery. So I think that gives everyone a pretty good idea of how he feels. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh man. So I think and exactly where you emphasize things is exactly where I had underlined things like we could go on and on about what the end of education is and what it's become. And to say that its end is a noble unrest, an ever renewed awakening from the dead, a ceaseless questioning of the past for the interpretation of the future. I mean, that's exactly right, in my opinion. It's also the thing that is systematically underplayed now, or even denied. I mean, if you commodify education in his sense into, we'll sell you the acquisition of certain skills so that you can have a certain career and you make a certain amount of money and live a certain lifestyle, then you're doing exactly what he says, which is suppressing all these other faculties. But that's just by way of introducing, his main claim here about the imagination, which I think, I wonder what you think about this. I almost get the sense that he thinks of the imagination as the faculty of all faculties.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And
Yes.
so
It is.
that the top of that, or well, it's not the top of, but on this page, where I wrote thesis, which is what the last thing you read,
Yeah.
is that to inquire what God has made is the main function, into what God has made is the main function of the imagination. It's aroused by facts, it's nourished by facts, seeks higher and higher laws of those facts,
Right.
but refuses to regard science as a sole interpretive nature. I mean, this has so many resonances for me in MacDonald's own writings, like having the main character at the beginning of Lilith reading like Francis Bacon and
Hmm.
certain what is it he uses, or some ancient mathematician, but sort of these systems and cathedrals of the intellect.
Right.
But the whole rest of the novel is drawing out the imagination of
Yeah.
the main character. But anyway, so no, I just think that's that really is in a lot of ways the whole question, right? Is what appears to our senses, is that all there is?
Hmm.
Is there
Yeah.
anything else we can derive?
Yeah.
So.
And not only that, I might even go so far as to say, do we have a sense that we're just ignoring, that helps us to interpret, the things that our five senses are taking in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I told you already, I have a whole bunch of notes here, but I don't want to just dominate the conversation. So was there anything in particular that you read that really just, that you want to talk about, or?
Well, I have to say, so there is one thing that comes immediately to mind, and then I kind of do want to just see where you want to go. Later in the essay, it's funny because he quotes Thomas Carlyle,
Yep.
and then says in a footnote, like, I actually had already written my essay, and then I saw, I got this passage from Carlyle and threw it in there.
Yeah.
But it's what's amazing to me is I almost say like the freshness of the thesis or the claim here about prose and poetry and language itself, because
Right.
you can read somebody like that's still alive who wrote an important book on metaphor called her name is Janet Soskis. She's sort of a theologian, and but she wrote this book on like metaphor and the use of language in theology. And basically what he's saying here, I'm not saying she's aware of this, but like it's almost exactly her whole point, which
Right.
is her whole point was like language tends to move from the metaphorical to the literal rather than the
Right.
reverse.
Right.
And that's exactly what he says. So there's this part here where he says, all words then belonging to the inner world of the mind or of the imagination and are originally poetic words. The better, however, any such word is fitted for the needs of humanity, the sooner it loses its poetic aspect by the commonness of use, ceases to be heard as a symbol, and appears only as a sign. I mean, in a way, right there, I think is you can almost say that means that the depth of our perception, whether it's of nature, of creation, of scripture, of art, of ourselves, the depth of our perception is itself kind of the symptom of our spirit. Because do you see this as a symbol or a sign?
Right. Right.
And like that's I would say that's the work of faith ultimately.
Right. And what I find interesting about that is I'm actually just trying to remember if he talk about poetic relations in this one or in the Fantastic Imagination. Sometimes I get them mixed up.
Yeah, I think it's the Fantastic Imagination, but
Yeah, I think it is too. But anyway, he likes to talk about poetic relations, and I think he has a very specific thing in mind when he uses those words. And I think he's thinking of incarnation, and that is precisely what symbol is, right? It's when you bring things together. So you give life, or you give body or substance to a concept or an idea or whatever it is, right?
mm-hmm.
That's what an icon is.
Mm-hmm.
So for George MacDonald, poetic relations is what the incarnation is.
There we go.
Oh,
Are you there?
yeah, I'm here. Sorry,
Okay.
I have to let my internet in.
I love it.
Strange.
Get it flow.
Yeah.
Yeah, he keeps using he has that nice line at one point where he says, like the whole world is but the human being inside out.
I know. Yeah. I'm going to tackle that one.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I got a whole bunch of stuff here.
Right. And all, and sort of the forms in nature and so forth. But he also will, yeah, like you're saying, he'll call it the embodiment, he'll talk about God's embodiment and all these things. So
right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to read a little bit from my notes because I tend to say things better when I write them down than if I.
Fair enough.
So I'm just going to jump in here. So this essay, it seems to me, is about the incarnational quality of creation, the intersection between creation, human language, and incarnation. And so I have this first quote here. Striking to me is his idea that creation is God's imagination. So I don't know if you grab that out of there. And it's also the origin of language, right? So he says, for what are the forms by means of which a man may reveal his thoughts? Are they not those of nature? But although he is created in the closest sympathy with these forms, yet even these forms are not born in his mind. What springs there is the perception that this or that form is already an expression of this or that phase of thought or of feeling. For the world around him is an outward figuration of the condition of his mind, an inexhaustible storehouse of forms whence he may choose exponents, the crystal pitchers that shall protect his thought and not need to be broken, that the light may break forth. The meanings are in those forms already, else they could be no garment of unveiling. God has made the world that it should thus serve his creature, developing in service that imagination whose necessity it meets. The man has but to light the lamp within the form. His imagination is the light. It is not the form. Straightway the shining thought makes the form visible and becomes itself visible through the form. This was one of the most amazing things out of this essay that jumped out at me. So have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so two thoughts. One is, again, I always find if I read anything of MacDonald, it illuminates other parts of what he's written. So I've always noticed and liked how he likes to use Plato's old idea that vision works by the light going out of the eyes, and then the reflection returning to the eyes. And so but and I think MacDonald, he likes to use that. He uses it in some of the fairy tales and so on, but in this poetic connection sort of way, where it's like, it's sort of Christ saying about, nothing comes out of a person except what's already in there. Out of the storehouse of their heart comes their words,
right?
And you could say actions. And so, so there's that there, to me, feels like he's hitting on that theme. But I think the second thought that comes to mind, I think, and I like this stuff, so I'm not trying to denigrate it, but like, there's a lot now about sort of the say the individual psyche's unconscious or subconscious, or the id or something like that, and we can sort of discover that something's within us that we are unaware of, or only vaguely aware of, or indirectly, and sort of through this different work, whether it's through therapy or through introspection or through conversations or whatever, through prayer, you can sort of unearth or disinter aspects of yourself. But what I noticed, especially about, which is true, but what I noticed especially about this passage in MacDonald, is that it almost sounds to me, and I know he's prior to like psychoanalysis and all that, but it sounds to me like he's saying the same is true about what we call the external world.
Yeah.
It's that it's not just thought that's what's so amazing to me about this. And this really does get to what you call the incarnational aspect of creation, or the incarnation character of creation. It's not just that like nature can depict a generic idea,
Yeah.
or some sort of general connection we might make on the level of poetry or images or something. It's that somehow nature, which seems in a sense the most impersonal, generic, vague thing when I consider it as just a big whole, it somehow has within it not just thoughts or forms, but my thoughts.
Yes. Exactly.
Your thoughts, like
Yeah.
the thoughts unique, what I thought were unique to
Yeah.
me, and in a sense they are. I mean, he's playing with the whole you discover, you create, creation,
Yeah.
discovery are sort
Yeah.
of all one. But that to me, that's such a beautiful and interesting and rich thought. I wonder what
It
you
is.
think about that.
Oh, I love it. So you pointed out to me once that, or I heard you saying it. I don't know if we were in conversation, but you mentioned a quote from George MacDonald: God always means what he says. We always mean more than what we say.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's why what the quote
Yes.
because God imparts meaning into his creation. So there's two things for me here. One of them is the creation outside of us, but it's also the creation that we are a part of. And I think like what's really on my heart most of the time is to communicate to people that when God talks about creation, when Maximus talks about creation, when George MacDonald talks about creation, that includes us.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a separate thing from us.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all one thing. And we act on it and it acts on us. And so there's a conversation happening within God's creation with his creation.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I recently listened to a conversation with Michael Levin and Ian McGilchrist.
Oh, nice! Wow,
And
I need to check that out.
Yeah, it's the most recent one, and they were just talking. Michael Levin's doing research now where he's researching not just the thing that's reaching, like the organism that he's studying that's reaching out towards something, but the actual phenomena of attraction that's being exerted on the creature from the outside world. Because it seems to him, and it's always seemed to me, that it's a reciprocal relationship, right? That these things are drawing each other towards each other. And so, and the God always means what he says, and we mean more than what we say, is because the meaning that God imparts to something is so fractal and multivalent that if we use, because language is derived, according to George in this essay, language derives itself from creation. We look around us, as he says in the essay, for something to use to express our inner thoughts and feelings, and we take from creation to do that, right? He uses the word emotion to as an example, and but within that form is an eternity of meaning.
Yes.
Because God put it there. So, but God is saying exactly what he wants to say with it. When we use that word to express ourselves, we're using only a tiny portion of the meaning that's contained within it. And I think that this is really interesting because it's become apparent to me over the years that the most difficult thing that we have in communicating with each other is conveying our meaning. Right? For this reason, because the meaning is so powerful, really. Like it's so huge that we can never really be precise enough with our words to get our meaning across. And so we say, do you know what I mean?
Right,
do you get
exactly.
what I'm saying?
Yes.
You know?
Yes. And we say, I like this, right? Whether it's in, they say it all the time in French, tu vois, or
Yeah, you see?
or you see, right? And
Yeah.
we tie that up, right? I mean, part of that's kind of been the dominant image for perceiving or for knowledge, or like, the light or whatever. But at the same time, there's something else there. I mean, this is kind of itself an example of what you're saying, right? Where it's like it's saying both at once. It's meaning more than what it says.
Right.
Is we kind of sense that, like, this is a funny thing, right? It's like the kind of meaning you're talking about, the meaning that we sense, and why it is that we never quite say what we mean. It's because anytime I'm meaning anything or signifying anything, even to myself, I don't always. I'm picking up resonances that I didn't necessarily intend. So the scope of my intentionality is not sufficiently dilated in
Mm,
order to let in the full light of meaning, which is coming through everything.
right.
And even myself, it's coming from myself. I love that passage, which I'm sure we'll get to in a little bit, where he has this odd moment where he kind of considers the unconscious. He does say the unconscious, and depicts it as like a darkness within, but then
Oh, that's right.
God residing in the chamber of darkness. So isn't there a more fundamental light coming through? I mean, obviously that reminds me of the end of Lilith and everything, but still,
Mhm.
like, so there's this, I never say, I always mean more than I say, both because the material, as it were, from which I'm drawing, nature for language, is
Right.
always already has more meaning in it. And I myself, as a person, as a meaning maker or
Yeah.
seer or producer, I'm always invoking resonances whose chorus or harmony, it far surpasses my composition.
Right. 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 Yeah. No, totally. Yeah.
And so at some point, all I can say is, do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, do you see it? And I think that's the last thing I was going to say on this was, like, this to me is another point at which God's meaning, God's speaking creation, and God's incarnating into creation as creation are all one, because
Yeah. Mhm.
because God is so, like, it's almost like God's intention, what Maximus at one point calls God, that he says God created the world through prudence, which is an odd
Oh,
thing to say.
interesting.
It's God's intention is, in a sense, hyper determinate. It's
Yes.
so determinate. It's
Yeah.
so utterly a unification of saying and meaning that
Mhm.
the only thing adequate to its expression or communication is simply the reality itself of it, the
Right.
embodying of it.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I don't remember if it's in here or if it's in the other essay, but George MacDonald says, if not thought and act be one and the same thing for God. Right.
Exactly. Right.
So yeah, definitely. Oh yeah, that part that you mentioned about the consciousness, when I first read the essay, I could not make heads or tails of that for the longest time. I don't have it in one of my quotes, but maybe we should read it right now.
Yeah, let me find that. I know I marked it because I was surprised. Yeah. I know it's here.
Towards the end, I think.
Yeah, here it is. Okay. So I'll start. Where I'll start. Okay, so yeah, I'll just have to go back. I'll just start where he says Ruskin.
Okay.
Ruskin, and better authority, we do not know, will assert the latter. I'm sorry, that doesn't make sense. Let me just start at the beginning. I'll just start at the beginning of the
There's a
paragraph.
lot of context. It's so
Yes.
hard to just take quotes out of here. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just do the paragraph. Okay.
We'll do it.
But as to this matter of creation, is there, after all, I ask yet, any genuine sense in which a man may be said to create his own thought forms? Allowing that a new combination of forms already existing might be called creation, is the man, after all, the author of this new combination? Did he, with his will and his knowledge, proceed wittingly or consciously to construct a form which should embody his thought? Or did this form arise within him without will or effort of his, vivid if not clear, certain if not outlined? Ruskin, and better authority we do not know, will assert the latter, and we think he is right. though perhaps he would insist more upon the absolute perfection of the vision than we are quite prepared to do. Such embodiments are not the result of the man's intention. There we are. Here, this is the stuff we were just talking about. Such embodiments are not the result of the man's intention or of the operation of his conscious nature. His feeling is that they are given to him, that from the vast unknown, where time and space are not, they suddenly appear in luminous writing upon the wall of his consciousness. Can it be correct then to say that he created them? Nothing less so, as it seems to us, but can we not say that they are the creation of the unconscious portion of his nature? Yes, provided we can understand that that which is the individual, the man, can know and not know that it knows, can create and yet be ignorant that virtue has gone out of it. This is, let's go a little bit more. From that unknown region we grant they come, that is the unconscious, but not by its own blind working. Nor, even were it so, could any amount of such production, where no will was concerned, be dignified with the name of creation. But God sits in that chamber of our being in which the candle of our consciousness goes out in darkness and sends forth from thence wonderful gifts into the light, that understanding which is his candle. Yeah, that is.
Can you elaborate on that? But God sits in that chamber of our being in which the candle of our consciousness goes out in darkness and sends forth. So what's sending forth? God sending forth, or the candle sending forth from thence wonderful gifts into the light of that understanding, which is his candle? Like it's, that was such a
it is a lot. This I think is probably the densest paragraph, but here's the way I'd put it, and maybe this isn't quite right. You can tell me if you think this lands. Or maybe George meant it, even if he didn't say it. Or said it and meant it, unbeknownst to him. But
we're going to take whatever meaning we're capable of.
Exactly right. So here's the I've always maybe I can use this analogy from Plato's allegory of the cave, or just a comparison here.
Yeah.
Since we're doing dark and light, and one of the things I've always really admired about that, that story, which everyone, who's ever had I don't know if anyone ever invokes Plato in class, or if we've got like a survey or whatever, you would usually focus on just the story, and can be used in many ways. But one of the things that I think isn't always sufficiently dwelled upon is Plato says, when that person who gets loosened from the chains and is no longer simply looking at the shadows and sort of following the light up to the opening out of the cave where they're going to see the sun and all that. One thing that he says that I've always thought was such a keen insight is he says, when that person first sees the light, they see darkness.
Oh, wow.
And not only do they see darkness, some of that you can imagine, right? Acclimating, if it's too bright or whatever. But the thing that's really impressive to me is he doesn't just say they see darkness. The seeing of the darkness, which is actually caused by the light, causes that person to doubt that they are going towards reality any longer.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
So this is what that has always told me. And then as I reread this, actually, it didn't really dawn on me until we just reread it.
Yeah.
That something that is just sheer meaninglessness, like utter absurdity, and something which is hyper meaningful, initially both appear the same.
Yeah.
They have the same effect, which is to kind of put me in a darkness.
Yeah, like an unknowability.
Exactly. And so so this is what I always tell people, like, or my students, I always say, like, mystery, it can be said in many ways and invoked in different moments. And sometimes there is such a thing as a determinate mystery, like something that it's not just you don't know, but maybe you will. It's something that must be a mystery. Right. And that's actually a very hard one. That's not just a random admission of ignorance. That's a what Nicholas of Cusa would have called a learned ignorance. It's an ignorance that ought to be ignorant in order to know it.
Right. Right.
So how I read this, or how I'm hearing this now, is sort of this like people can sort of debate the question of whether or not my meaning or my perception of meaning in nature or in poetry or literature, is this something that I just find already objectively given, something I didn't really then therefore could create or generate or contribute to, or is this something I wholly and completely concocted, fancy, as that initial interlocutor was worried about, was why don't we just stick with the facts rather than fancy?
Yeah.
But so in a sense, this is really one of the main messages throughout the whole essay, as I take it, is that he's trying to explode the whole framework. You can't say there's only fact and fancy unless you have completely mastered the realm of both.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and the truth is, even though there's a phenomenological or an experiential truth to the idea that, sometimes when some thought comes, something like from my depths, or some phrase or some insight, I don't always know who is the author of that. Whence does it come? Is it true or not? Does it have any meaning, or is it just sort of mumbo jumbo? There is an initial sort of phenomenal experiential moment of unsettlement, and I just don't know where I'm at. And then the question will be, proceeding from there, do I come to see it as hyper illumined?
Yeah.
Or something that doesn't even get to the level of the understanding or the intellect, which is therefore just nonsense and dark for that reason, because it's empty.
But there's always a sense, though, when we have those thoughts, and we have them, like, people can tell you, everyone, I think, should be able to talk about an experience where they're like, I don't know where I got that thought.
Right.
Everyone has that experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you were just talking about it, I was thinking, God sits in that chamber of our being in which the candle of our consciousness goes out in darkness. That's the question. I don't know where that thought came from.
Right.
But God's sitting in there.
Yes.
Yes. And the thought seems to come out of nowhere, right?
Exactly. Just like creation.
Yeah. Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay, we better move on, because we can keep talking about this. And I want to try to fit in all my little thingies here. So, in that first quote, one of the things that really struck me, because I had done some reading of Barfield, I read Saving the Appearances and stuff like that, some of his essays, and then I read the Imagination essay, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is Barfield's language. Figuration, representation, form, and also the fact that Barfield is also exploring language and where language comes from, which is really what MacDonald is doing. He starts there. He starts with language. To illustrate that it's from creation that we are able to communicate. Like, I love the example he uses where he's like, you can only get so far with making faces,
Right.
And then you go to panic mode. You're searching around for something to, hook onto, so you can give your friend your inner feelings, about something. So here's the second quote in that regard. We have already said that the forms of nature, by which word forms we mean any of those conditions of nature which affect the senses of man. So, I think he's saying the wind is in there too, right? Like the things you can't see.
Yes.
Are so many approximate representations of the mental conditions of humanity. So the forms of nature are the approximate representations of the mental conditions of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
The outward, commonly called the material, is informed by or has form in virtue of the inward or immaterial. In a word, the thought. The forms of nature are the representations of human thought in virtue of their being the embodiment of God's thought. Like, think about that. I haven't read your book. And I haven't read much of Maximus, but I think Maximus would have been jumping up and down when you heard that?
I mean, this is like, yeah, that is. So there's the kind of like first observation there of I feel like often what McDonald's saying is something similar to what Lewis says at the end of the discarded image, where though he talks there in terms of models and stuff, but what this passage is saying is like, we can use an easy example of, we often use external, conditions, the conditions of nature to describe our internal. So like I feel like my stomach is churning,
Yeah. Yeah.
or I feel like a sort of, there's like, I'm going through a storm. Things are
Yeah.
just sort of turbulent, all these different, that's easy to see how those can go. But or like that person is so dependable. They're like a rock, solid
Yeah.
as a rock,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's like these sorts of expressions, which of course once were very fresh and original poetic expressions, as he would say, but have sort of hardened into, what does he say, the mummies of prose.
Mummies of prose.
Which is just so good. But uh that it's such a perfect expression, right? Because it's like a mummy was once alive, and in a
Yeah.
certain sense you can kind of still see it's like the traces of its
Yeah.
vitality.
Yeah.
But anyway, that it's almost like he's saying, but how could those be even useful on the level of language and expression if they themselves don't already have an immaterial dimension
Right.
to them?
Right.
I mean, I think it's sort of a basic point he's making over and over and over again. But then the next thing to think, and this really does, I was going to almost save this to the end, but I don't know if it's okay. Maybe I can read
Oh,
this.
go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Because of the connection he had at the end of that quote about God's thought.
Yeah.
This is by in virtue of God, the embodiment of God's thought. Okay, so here is from Maximus. Of course, I was going to bring it out at some point.
Yes.
It's one of my favorite passages on these themes. This is from the introduction to responses and questions to Thalassius, which is Maximus is just answering a bunch of questions about difficult scriptural passages. And so in the introduction, he's talking about interpreting scripture, but he uses this image. He says this about scripture: the divine word is like water, for just as water operates in different species of plants and vegetation, and in different kinds of living things, by which I mean in human beings who drink the word himself. The word, capital W, the word is manifested in them through the virtues. Like burgeoning fruit produced according to the quality of the virtue and knowledge in each person, so that the word becomes known to others through other qualities and characteristics. For the divine word could never be circumscribed by a single individual interpretation, nor does it suffer confinement in a single meaning on account of its natural infinity. And so you kind of got everything there, right?
Yeah.
You've got like you said, he would be jumping up and down because it's the same sort of stuff. We've got the fact that the word, the expression, the meaning is being embodied in us. But here he's placing it directly in the context of scripture. But what I love about it, he's saying, look, it's the word himself is like water. And like water, it can be incorporated into all these manifestations of organic bodies.
Yeah.
And then what's great about it, though, and this maybe is, I don't think actually it differs that much from water, because then you can go back and look at water anew. And now we start using water in our poetry like it's the source of refreshing,
Right.
the fountain of youth or whatever.
It flows.
It flows, exactly.
Yeah.
But what I love about this, and I try to like put this forward as a way of even interpreting scripture, but I would ultimately save the whole world, because it's all the word's body, embodiments, is like I can look at you, Shari, and I can look at other people, and what actually happens is I see the word, the meaning of God, God's thoughts. I see something, some content, some determination, some aspect of the word that I could not find anywhere else in all of the cosmos.
Right.
And yet it's reciprocal, like you were saying, the conversation, because now after I see that in you, and of course you're an inexhaustible wellspring too, and so everyone is, so it's not like that ends. But say I learned something of Christ in you, I can now, it's not just now that helps me sort of get Christ like intellectually. Now I start to see the very thing I saw in you, but that you inflected in a way that I couldn't otherwise see. Now I go back and see it in everything.
Right. Right. Yeah. Now it's, yeah. Well, out of that quote that you just read before this, the MacDonald quote, he says, yes, provided we can understand that which is the individual, the man can know and not know that it knows,
Exactly.
can create and yet be ignorant of the virtue that has, and I'll just say, he says gone, but in light of Maximus, we can say flows
Yes.
out of it.
Yes.
Right. And this is, I love that. I've always loved that statement. Be ignorant of the virtue that flows out of you, right? The thing that you were just talking about, where somebody sees Christ in you and then starts to see it all over the world, like everywhere they look, kind of thing. This is, what was I going to say about that now? Well, it's what saints do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Like they're totally ignorant of the virtue that's flowing out of them because of their humility. So it's also because of their humility. It's so weird. Like their humility makes them ignorant of the virtue that flows out of them, which makes them feel like the chiefest of sinners.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
This sort of sounds to me like, Matthew 25, Lord,
Yeah.
when did we see you and feed you?
Right. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
They didn't even know they were feeding Christ. Now
Mhm.
that says something about Christ because it says something about his kenosis. He's so self-effacing that he's
Yeah.
easily misrecognized all the time.
Yeah.
But also it says something about them, like you were just saying, which I hadn't quite thought of until you just said that, which is that they also are so self-effacing. They don't even realize the virtue within them that's coming out of them. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
I
great.
know. It's incredible. Okay.
I want to say one last thing.
Okay, yeah, go.
You've unleashed me. So no, but it's something I wanted to say earlier. I forgot. So just before we move off this passage,
Mhm.
it's exactly that line you read in that where was it? You just read it. The not knowing thing. Where did that go?
Oh, that's in that Ruskin paragraph.
Yeah, exactly. Now
It's
I get
about 6 lines below Ruskin.
okay.
I just
Oh yeah. Okay.
at least in my copy.
No, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. So, is this right? Are they a creation of the unconscious portion of his man or humanity's nature? Yes, provided we can understand that which is the individual, the man can know and not know that it knows, can create and yet be ignorant, etc. Here's what I want to say. This is one of those. I'm just going to say it, and who knows if it's. But
Yeah, just go.
I feel like this would be like a George MacDonald counterpoint to Freud before Freud. Here's what I mean. And it's not just because he uses the word unconscious, but for Freud, the realm of the unconscious or subconscious is also in that liminal space of just beyond the express knowledge of yourself.
Right.
It's just beyond enough that you're often unaware of it, yet it's just liminal enough, sort of bleeding over, that it does affect the way you act and react and think in various situations. And so, but very often that realm, what he calls the id, is very much the kind of, it's very negative,
It
right?
is
And
negative. Yeah, that's
yeah,
what
and it's like, and I actually don't think that's wrong entirely. I mean, I think that, so for him, right, the work of of analysis is to make you more and more aware of this, so that you'll, in hopes of having some kind of control, or at least a sort of return to some semblance of equilibrium, right? That you would have had otherwise, apart from this or that trauma that's happened in your past or whatever. And I think, look, in terms of just purely diagnostic, often something like that I think is happening. I'm not interested in denying that. However, the thing I think, unfortunately, that tends to do is it tends to make depths a direct correlate, the depths of your person, a direct correlate of like negativity.
Hell.
Hell, exactly, right? The depths of hell. And when
Depth.
you have a MacDonald sort of approach, what you see is no, the depths of God are deeper than hell, even
Exactly.
in you. And
Yes.
so God resides in that chamber.
Yes.
And God is, as it were, already in conversation with you, even apart from your explicit knowing that all the time.
Right. And you're not even aware of the virtue that flows out of you, right? And here's the thing. I mean, John Vervaeke's made a really good case for what he calls reciprocal narrowing. So if you focus on something, you end up, becoming that thing. Or how I used to observe it was I would watch people focus on how much they hated their parents, let's say. They were full of bitterness and resentment. And before I knew it, 10 years later, they were just like their parents,
Yeah,
just
totally.
like them. And I'm like, okay, that's not working for you, right? So, so if you were to focus on the Freudian aspect of your depths of, your hellish, blackish soul, which sounds very totally depraved to me, actually, then of course that's what's going to inhabit you. It's going to be the water that flows. It's going to be that, not so great virtue that's flowing out of you. You know what I'm saying? So wouldn't it be better if we were to remember that we have a dark chamber in our heart, but a good one, where it's, the light of God fills it so that it's dark to us. Right? We can't see it. We don't know that we know it. Like, this is the thing. This is the thing that I love about George MacDonald so much, because he's always giving us the benefit of the doubt. He's always telling us it's okay, kids.
Right.
It's okay, And he says the man can know and not know that it knows.
Right. Exactly. And what I love about, don't you think too that this really goes at the heart of, this is the thing I liked about the Fantastic Imagination the first time I read that one, is you get the sense that George thinks that we, like, in general, we as like a human race or a society, we've basically entered our teenage years, and as a stereotypical teenager does, thinks that means you are mature simply because you're no longer a child in a derogatory sense. But the thing is, all that means is what you've really done is misperceived your own depths.
Yeah.
And you think the thing that's really deep is actually just the surface of something just below the surface. And the real depths are far more serious. They're far deeper. But for him, like you said, they're far more salutary, good, beautiful, true.
Right.
And they're really the inaccessible light in which God dwells looks like darkness to us, but it's only because it's super illuminating. And this gets to me, this gets to like this, back to like what I love about George MacDonald too, maybe is another way to put what I'm trying to say here, is George MacDonald is one of these like childlike, the way he talks about childlikeness and the child in the midst. He gives it the depths of maturity, but it never loses the wonder of childhood.
Right.
And somehow he actually manages in millions of ways to show that they're actually the same.
Yeah. He even
They're
calls
one.
God childlike.
Exactly. And he depicts God. I love that. I can't remember which fairy tale it is now, but God is appearing. He appears 3 times throughout the fairy tale, and each time he gets younger. And the last appearance is a child playing with toys.
Is it that is the golden key where
Yes.
God, that he's the old man at the center of fire.
Yes, exactly.
In the earth, and he's naked. He's a naked baby playing with balls.
Exactly. That's what it is. And it's this progressive, and so so the depths, right? The progression into, because they're like going through the mountain, they're getting deeper into the progression, which is the sort of ever deepening, is somehow simultaneously an ever youthful becoming ever
Yeah,
youthful.
yeah,
And so carving up the world into like the realists who are real pragmatists who see the way things really are versus the sort of supposedly naive idealists who are just sort of rose tinted glasses. That's just not the framework that
no,
actually matters. It's not relevant.
no. And it should be said here too, for anybody who doesn't know, that George MacDonald was not just a fairy tale writer.
Right. Right.
He had a master's in what, physics and chemistry, I think, right?
I think so. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
physics
Yep.
and chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And in his poem, The Hidden Life, which if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's incredible. He talks about a young man who went to university from a farm, like was a farmer's son. His schoolmaster saw that he had a gift and then, took him under his wing, got him sent off to university. And he, in the end of the poem, decides to go back to live with his father and work on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's telling him that he should be using his gifts for such higher callings.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
It's such a similar thing to Robert Falconer.
Oh, okay. I haven't read that one.
Okay, and it's also often considered somewhat autobiographical. I don't totally know, but it's this young boy who's raised by his grandma, who's a hardcore Calvinist.
Oh yeah,
and but they're out in the country too, and but he ends up going into I think Glasgow or whatever where the university is in the city, and he's really 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 talented. But then he ends up going back and living in his hometown, and so that theme comes up a lot. Or I think of the characters in What's Mine's Mine. I'm not sure if that's.
I haven't read that one either.
I have not finished that one. I'm about
Okay.
2/3 of the way through.
I heard it's really, really
it's great.
different.
It's
Is
very
it?
different. Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
about this tribal, sort of people that are like almost aboriginal to parts of Scotland, but then there's these young girls that are from the sort of the regular, the sort of cultivated aristocratic class, and they have this vacation home. And anyway, but there's this interaction there. But some of the main characters there, like the tribal chief and his brother, they're very good personifications or embodiments of exactly this sort of what I would call just straight up the imagination.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One is more bookish than the other, but they both are like, you get the sense that they're both sort of equally, they have this equal genius, though it's manifold. And so anyway, but anyway, I could go on about that, but I'll stop.
Okay, well, we've got half an hour left, so maybe I'll just throw a bunch of stuff at you.
Let's do it.
We'll seed. I'm going to sow some seeds.
There we go.
All right. What do I got here? Oh yeah, I also had another quote. Let me read this one, and then I'll just give you my comment. I don't know if we need to say much more than that, but he talks about a right imagination. So the subtitle of this essay is "Its Culture and Function." The imagination, its culture and function.
Mm-hmm.
And so towards the end of it, he does make it very clear that you have to culture the imagination well, he's speaking to teachers, I think, or parents, in their children. And there are some things that he says you should I don't know the word he uses, not punish, but you shouldn't allow them to go down that road anyway of imagination.
Right.
But so anyway, I'll just read this. A right imagination being the reflex of creation. That's an interesting phrase. Will fall in with the divine order of things as the highest form of its own operation. Will tune its instrument at the door to the divine harmonies within. So and I always had the impression through the whole essay that for him, the right imagination is when you are seeking out the things of God, right? So that's a rightly oriented imagination. So it's going to tune its instrument at the door to the divine harmonies within. We'll be content alone with growth towards the divine idea. That'll make it happy, right? Just moving towards the divine, which includes all that is beautiful in the imperfect imaginations of men. will know that every deviation from that growth is downward, and will therefore send the man forth from its loftiest representations to do the commonest duty of the most wearisome calling in a hardy and hopeful spirit, which is the story of him leaving the university and going back to the farm, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the work of the right imagination, and towards this work every imagination, in proportion to the rightness that is in it, will tend. The reveries even of the wise man will make him stronger for his work. His dreaming as well as his thinking will render him sorry for past failure and hopeful of future successes.
Mm.
So, like, he's basically saying if you're rightly oriented towards God, and therefore you're operating with a right imagination, and I think right for him is like it's actually like right as in straight and true.
Mm-hmm.
You will be made to conform to the image of Christ. Like it's just going to naturally unfold,
Mm-hmm.
and that it seeks harmony, I think, is really interesting too, because there's kind of a, I don't know what Maximus does he talk about harmony?
It's funny. I was just having a conversation. He talks about he does. He'll use the word, the ancient Greek word all the way from the Stoics, sympathy, where we get sympathy, sympathia, which is
Yeah,
to suffer with or sort of have this
yeah,
mutual affection. And
yeah.
but also, I think one really beautiful image that I sort of uncovered when I was first studying him was he often likes to talk about our theosis as occurring right by grace, not by nature. But sometimes he'll replace grace and he'll say it occurs by position, not by nature.
Mm,
And I just thought that was a kind of katathesin, thesis, like thesis. And so you're like, I was like, what's that? And so I started digging around a little bit, and actually the most and the nearest ancient analog I could find to that juxtaposition was in ancient prosody. Instructions like this author called Dionysius Thrax on instructions on how to the proper way to do rhetoric, or to in the context of oratory, to speak correctly in the time and place, but in such a way that you kind of know the art. It's called the art of the speaker. You know how to stress certain words or to elongate certain syllables that are not by nature long,
right.
but you make them long by pronunciation
Yeah.
so that they match, for example, and sort of create a greater harmony or resonance with other words around it, or a stanza of poetry.
Oh, interesting.
And so what's so interesting to me is that image is then, no, you are not divine. You're not deified by nature in the sense of like, you're not just God from the very get-go. However, God makes you his own children. He makes you gods. Uh, Maximus would say by position, which to me, in other words, it's because all this comes through the word. God pronounces us in
Right.
such a way that even though we're by nature mortal, right, we're not fit for being divine. His own pronunciation in and through the very sort of structures of our
Oh,
being, makes us what he is by nature.
through resonance.
Exactly, through resonance, through grace, his favor
Yeah,
pouring
yeah, yeah.
through all the stuff we've been talking about.
So we come into harmony
Yeah.
with God. Oh,
Hmm.
wow. Okay. So there's another, there's the one quote that I read earlier. The man has but to light the lamp within the form.
Hmm.
His imagination is the light, it is not the form. Straightway the shining thought makes the form visible and becomes itself visible through the form. So when I first was going through the essay, I think it was on the third go round reading this, I was like, oh my God, that's the lantern in Narnia.
Oh, right.
It's like the man has but to light the lamp within the form. So today I did a little digging, and there's Jadis in The Magician's Nephew throws a piece of a lamppost from London at Aslan, and it lands in Narnia and grows there.
Huh. I don't remember this. Wow.
It's in The Magician's Nephew. And so, and everybody, like I remember when I first had that aha moment, I was looking it up because I thought, oh, somebody must have thought of this. And everybody had all these ideas of what the lamp was in Narnia, because when Lucy comes through the wardrobe, there's the lamp and it's lit.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody says anything about it, right? And then they have to find their way back to the lamp in order to get out again. So anyway, here's something. And then also keep in mind that Lucy went through a wardrobe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It's through a wardrobe that they get into. Okay, so here we go. For the world is the human being turned inside out. All that moves in the mind is symbolized in nature, or to use another more philosophical and certainly not less poetic figure, the world is a sensuous analysis of humanity, and hence an inexhaustible wardrobe for the clothing of human thought.
Also great that Lucy's name, of course, is related to light. Lucia.
Lucia, yeah.
Yep.
And so Lucy goes through the inexhaustible wardrobe, which is nature. She comes out into Narnia, and what's there? It's a lamp. And what does he say about the lamp? He says, the man has but to light the lamp within the form.
That's
the
awesome.
form is Narnia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so his imagination is the light. It's not the form. And, most people, when they think about imagination, they think of it as I'm making shit up. Right? I'm making up forms. No, that's not your imagination. Your imagination is the light within the lamp. The light that lights the lamp within the form.
Right.
It's illuminating the meaning that God put into it. So anyway, isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is. And it just kind of reminds me of the text that like some of the church fathers always love to quote, that deep calls out to deep. And that's really another image that I have, is that again, the God who is in the inner chamber is also sending the light through you. And then, MacDonald, sort of the light coming out of your eyes, but also there is, so you light up the form, but then the form itself has the capability already in it to being lit up and to reflect and to.
Well, it has a lamp in it.
Exactly.
And all you have to do is light it.
All you got to do is light it, and so
with your imagination.
Exactly. There's that harmony and that correspondence, right? And really, what it is it's God conversing with God's self in us and in His world.
Goosebumps.
That eternal the eternal conversation.
Yeah. Okay, there's one more. It's a little bit of a deeper subject, but I just wanted to hit on it with you because I've had some pushback about this. There's an idea that the doctrine of ex nihilo disrespects creation. It treats creation as nothing. I don't know where that comes from because I'm not a theologian. I'm sure that there are people who've done that with ex nihilo. All I know is the ex nihilo that George MacDonald talks about. And he talks about it here. So I'm going to read the quote. And so I've argued with people about ex nihilo on the basis of this. Poet means maker. We must not forget, however, that between creator and poet lies the one unpassable gulf, which distinguishes, far be it from us to say divides, all that is God's from all that is man's, a gulf teeming with infinite revelations, but a gulf over which no man can pass to find out God, although God need not pass over it to find man. The gulf between that which calls and that which is thus called into being, between that which makes in its own image and that which is made in that image. It is better to keep the word creation for that calling out of nothing, which is the imagination of God, except it be as an occasional symbolic expression whose daring is fully recognized of the likeness of man's work to the work of his maker. The necessary unlikeness between the creator and the created holds within it the equally necessary likeness of the thing made to him who makes it, and so of the work of the made to the work of the maker. When therefore refusing to employ the word creation of the work of man, we yet use the word imagination of the work of God, we cannot be said to dare at all. It is only to give the name of man's faculty to that power after which and by which it was fashioned. The imagination of man is made in the image of the imagination of God. And then there's a secondary quote. It has created none of the material that goes to make these forms, nor does it work upon raw materials, talking about man's imagination here, but it takes forms already existing and gathers them about a thought so much higher than they that it can group and subordinate and harmonize them into a whole, which shall represent, unveil that thought. So to me, ex nihilo in George MacDonald has everything to do with divine imagination. And it's not creation is nothing, but creation is everything. Like, so it's like the opposite of what I've heard other people arguing about when it comes to ex nihilo. God, the way that he's putting it here, God is creating from nothing. He's building a world, that the one that we live in. And we do what Tolkien would have said, we subcreate, we take from what's around us, and in that way we create. So George MacDonald says in the essay, he'd like to reserve the word creation for God, right? Because of ex nihilo, because of the fact that, like, we can't even actually, I've tried to do it. I've tried to fathom making something out of nothing, and I can't do it. I can't hear you for some reason. Are you muted?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so. This I'm glad you brought this up, because this kind of this did. I was so it sort of initially kind of gave me pause, because in I was just pulling this up, the in Robert Falconer, he has George has this character named Eric Erickson say that almost deny that we came from nothing. He says, because then it's a quote that says, because then nothing would be our God. And then he says instead, if we came from God, and then he goes on. Or like Mr. Raven and Lilith, he has this line kind of late in the novel where he says, Mr. Vane, when God created me, not out of nothing, as say the unwise, but out of his own endless glory.
Right.
Okay,
go ahead.
And so I was like, well, hold on. So we got, this is like a tension here, because we got him. He's very clear in this essay, like you just read out. I mean, he's very clear, like, no, nothing is the prerogative of God. And then, but what I thought was, is just a guess, like, John Scotus Eriugena from the 9th century, in his book, The Divisions of Nature, he actually has this long meditation about how the nothing from which all things have come is God.
Yeah.
And I think that's perhaps a way to like hold together this tension within MacDonald, that he's saying that too. Like there's different, like there's a wrong way to think of nothing.
Exactly.
And then there's the right way to think of nothing.
Yes. You need an imagination.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's hard to it's not like MacDonald thinks God is sitting around twiddling his thumbs. It's like, oh, I'm going to think of a thought, and then all of a sudden it's there, and that's creation, because that's almost unintended, right? But also it's not. I mean, this is exactly the paradox, right? It's not as if God randomly thinks up or capriciously or arbitrarily thinks up something. Nor is it that his absolute intentionality for the things his thoughts, they don't therefore undermine the freedom or the life of the thought itself as creation. That's the paradox, is that for God's intentionality, God's creation from nothing, to say God creates out of nothing is, on the one hand, just a denial that he has to work with pre-given material the way we often do, like when we're looking at nature,
Right.
we're trying to come up with our expressions or our poetry or something. But then the I think the deeper point isn't just that. It's not just a negation. It's it actually turns into an affirmation, which
Right.
says that God creates out of nothing. Like just as you ended there, right? It means that everything
Everything.
is a result of nothing but God.
Right. Right. And I mean that's what he gets into. I mean that's the whole he's trying to help us to understand that where we reside on this earth is God's imagination,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Exactly. Right.
And that imagination is so glorious that it can literally, you know, make a tree with no trees around it to compare to.
Mm-hmm.
It can design a tree right from the ground up. Like it has no, you know, it doesn't have any references. I'm trying to avoid the use of the word nothing. Like it doesn't, there's no footnotes, there's no guy before him who had the thought and that he can look back on, or he can find plans and drawings for a cloud or a human or an ant or
Right.
a beaver.
Yes.
They all come from his imagination, which is so, that's the nihilo that he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's not exactly what you said. There's no pre-given external set of circumstances or conditions that God has to then react to and work with almost as a second thought.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's the stuff. What do I do with it? What can I do with it? And so often our art is inherently limited by the material, by
Mm-hmm.
the stuff from which we make art. Now,
Right.
you can be more or less successful or more or less creative from it. But but exactly what you're saying is the point, is that God has no pre-given stuff from which he then has to form, or pre-given, a pre-given design or other artists that he sort of takes from.
Yeah.
That actually just means that his art is utterly unlimited by anything. Nothing
Right.
limits.
Right. I just thought of this other quote in here. Let me see if I can find it, where he talks about um, the history, all history is God's poetry or something like that. Um,
Oh yeah. I also underlined that. Where's that?
I love that one too.
Yeah, he in his poetry. Where was that? He says,
Here, I have it.
yes.
Would God give us a drama, he makes a Shakespeare. Or would he construct a drama more immediately his own? He begins with the building of the stage itself, and that stage is a world, a universe of worlds. He makes the actors, and they do not act. They are their part. He utters them into the visible work to work out their life, his drama. When he would have an epic, he sends a thinking hero into his drama. Instead of writing his lyrics, he sets his birds and maidens a singing. All the speech giving, all the processes of the ages are God's science. All the flow of history is his poetry. His sculpture is not in marble, but in living and speech giving forms which pass away, not to yield place to those that come after, but to be perfected in a nobler studio. What he has done remains, although it vanishes, and he never either forgets what he has once done or does it even once again. As the thoughts move in the mind of a man, so move the worlds of men and women in the mind of God. And make no confusion there, for there they had their birth, the offspring of his imagination. Man is but a thought of God.
And the thought of God is a creature that would have thoughts of its own as well. And this is like, I always say this to my students, like, a lot of this theology stuff would be so much easier if God had just simply decided to make a painting on a canvas, or if he just sort of wanted to set up a sort of table of mathematical matrices, or anything that didn't itself, I love that line you just read from MacDonald, not just play a part, but is the part.
Yeah.
You're not playing a role, you are the role. And the thing is, that says just as much or more about God's artistry and authorship
And originality.
and his creativity, right?
Yeah.
As it does about us, because it is, I almost want to just say it's so much informed by this sheer selfless ecstasy of love
Oh, yeah.
that that it that it doesn't want to make anything that isn't itself fundamentally contributing to its own creation.
Right.
And that does mean that creation is far more complicated, and there's far more dimensions and depths than would otherwise be necessary for something just like, here's a blank canvas, paint on it. But it also makes it, for that exact reason, infinitely more rich in meaning and in,
Yeah. And I would say this is something that has always been kind of on my heart is to, I often say in this little corner that we need to realize the story that we are in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what George MacDonald is trying to help us with.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to help us situate ourselves in God's imagination as, desperately loved by him.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that we don't know that we know things.
Right,
and
exactly.
that virtue flows out of us without us even knowing that.
Yeah.
Right. That this is a more beautiful story, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he's telling us.
And isn't this is so wonderful, right? Because what if I try to put it in the realm of the intellect or the understanding, as he says, it runs up against paradoxical limits, almost as if the very thing you need to really get all this is the imagination that he's recommending.
Right.
Because look, the way, like, one of the tensions throughout the essay that I take it he addresses a few times, like, directly, is one we've already touched on, which is, it's this, like, and like, there's a bunch of people that write about it. There's already people that are writing, like Coleridge has already written about it. All these people are writing about it. Later on, you'll get philosophers in the 20th century directly writing books on this. And it's the question of creativity, right? It's the basic question of, when I create, is this a sheer product of my own, almost like autonomous brain, or my own self, my own mind, or am I discovering something?
Right.
And of course, the kind of, and you can put it like this to be sort of cute, I guess. You could say, like, envenire in Latin, where from whence we get, invention, originally had both meanings.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
An invention is something that it's both something that is created, like it's new, innovative invention, but it also is something it can mean to discover. And so it's built into the word itself, or the concept itself, to say, this tension is about, when I create, am I the producer, or am I the finder? As he says, in the French, they say the finder.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what is only the imagination, rightly formed, cultured, can see that it's both. And so I think his stuff on being really strong on God alone creates from nothing, what that does is it secures the non-arbitrariness of the creation.
Right.
So it's not just a solipsistic, whatever, I'm going to make up stuff, fancy. It's not fancy in his terms.
Yeah, no.
On the other hand, it has the levity and the play of fancy.
Right.
Which is why people mistake it.
Yeah.
So we have the perfect coincidence of what seem to be opposites or contraries. We've got something that's fixed and therefore meaningful. It's not random or capricious. At the same time, it's playful. It is new.
Mm-hmm.
It is something that is produced and that I contribute to as a character.
And there is a Pan-like quality to God in this sense, because he's hiding within the creation. And let's just take the tree, for example. The tree itself can have many, many meanings to us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the tree is one of the most mythological entities, out there in the human imagination. And you could just page through time and see all the different ways people have interpreted what a tree is or what it means. And in that sense, God is still playful,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he puts so much meaning into that tree. He means what he says, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have the fun of finding that out,
Exactly.
which is just so beautiful.
And finding that out, right, is finding him out.
Finding exactly.
God means what he says, and he is what he means.
Yes. Yes.
That's the embodiment aspect, right? The incarnational aspect.
Right.
And so, like Maximus loves to say, if you search for the logos in all things, its own logos, its own principle, its own sort of structure of the way it is, you are simultaneously clinging to the logos,
Right.
the word. It also, I think, has this sort of amazing implication, and this is really mind bending to me. And I know we're running up against the time here, but God, this isn't only true just spatially and like in terms of forms and stuff. And that quote you read kind of hits at that, the unfolding of the poetry of history.
Yeah.
I've really been struck by this lately, and I've been thinking through and trying to understand the implications better. And I don't think I've got a full grasp on it, and probably never will. But it just seems like God, when God writes something, let's say that's creation or the book of nature or the book of scripture.
Yeah.
What's so amazing about it isn't just that it was timely or that it relates to various readers or interpreters in different ways. That's all amazing, sure. What I think is really perhaps the most striking aspect is that it's always responding to and in conversation with the very tradition of conversation interpretation that it's generating. So when God inspires scripture, it's not just adequate to get us going and like get the engines revving and our imagination sort of it is simultaneously responding to all of the input of the imagination or the interpreter that it itself will generate for the ages thereafter.
Tell me if I have this right, but what's coming to my mind is that anthropic principle of the observer.
Right, exactly.
Right? And how, like, that alone to me is proof positive that we are in relationship with God, because in order for anything to actually be or unfold itself, it has to be in a reciprocation, like a reciprocal somehow relationship, whether it's by observation or dialogue or whatever the case might be, with another living being.
Right.
So
and then what's amazing, right, is it does come down to exactly the imagination in terms of, because the imagination seeks the meaning, right? It seeks the forms of things. And it's like, I gave this example to my students last week. I said, do you ever just stop and think to yourself, for about 270 or 290 million years, this world was basically just a world full of giant, I know it's not correct technically to say, but giant reptiles. Like, and even if I'm just saying, if you take the science as it is, even if you like, I think the earliest hominids we have evidence of are about 2 million years ago. It's like, we've barely been here at all. And somebody can look at that vastness of that horizon, which has receded just in the last 150 years for us, like that, what they now call deep history. And you can say, you could look at that. I mean, this is the part where the imagination comes in, right? Because it's like, what is the point of that? Right? I'm asking about the meaning. 270 million years, no human observers, no observer at all, except what? God. And it's just sort of going. And of course, yeah, to God, who cares? Time's not really a big thing, whatever. But then this is the second thought. This is my illustration.
Yeah.
Maybe part of the meaning, whatever else we would say about that whole history, part of the meaning is that I can sit here right now and I can look back at that and ask that exact question.
Yeah.
And the answer is partially that the only thing required for any time or being or life, entirely in obscurity otherwise, to be is God's intent, God's own attention.
Well, that I'm just reminded me of where he says poet means maker, and all the flow of history is God's poetry.
Exactly.
So it's the making of,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And his
even if we reflect back on it, it still continues to exert that powerful creative process on us.
right, and that process on us was already within the very infinite intention of God as he intended that original thing that
Right.
now has that effect on us too.
Right.
Like you said, always this reciprocity.
Yeah. And I mean, we could throw in the whole time thing with God. Like there is no past, present, and future anyway.
Right. Exactly.
Which everyone hates to hear.
Bummer.
Well, I just wanted to end, actually. I wrote a poem. It's not very long.
Yes.
I wrote a poem a long time ago about that anthropic principle.
Love it.
And it was an actual encounter, like, for me in my farm here. It's called Yellow Flowers. They block my path on the way to the outhouse. Each head bobs precariously on bowed backs, smiling, bright, and eternally optimistic. I don't know their names, but they are everywhere. These stretch ever more tenuously across my path, asking to be seen. But what is my eye to them? Must it fall like the sun across their faces? A less glorious but still luminous orb? It seems to be so.
You need to get a book out there. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that was actually happening. Like, every time I went to the outhouse, there's these yellow flowers, and they were constantly a little more. And I actually thought about cutting them away. And then that thought came into my mind. I'm like, oh my gosh, they need me to look at them.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. Was.
Yeah, that's what a great example of exactly everything we've been talking about right there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also why primroses and roses and many different flowers appear as fairies in George MacDonald's work.
Mm.
Well, Jordan, this has been just a load of fun.
It's been great. I'm glad we finally got it to work out. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just going to throw it out there. It's a standing invitation, because I know we could spend hours talking about George. And if you threw out something to me, I'd grab that ball and run with it. So
okay, yeah, no, let's
whatever
think,
you want to do.
That.
I'm game. I'm totally
That's
game.
great. I love it. It's there's very few things more worthwhile than stewing in all this.
Yeah, telling the more beautiful story.
Exactly.
All right. Yep. Well, I thank everybody for being here, and I'm sorry that we didn't answer any questions. I didn't plan on asking any questions, and the reason I scheduled it as a live stream was because I feel like live streams are kind of the heart of the corner, when people can be together at the same time in real time, participating in a conversation. So yeah, this was a real honor and a real joy. And thank you so much, Jordan.
Well, I'm honored as well that you invited me. Thank you for giving me your time.
Yeah. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
All right. Bye.